Now, one of the main things that we're going to do is to show you what happens to someone's ventilation when they're given an artificial episode of airways obstruction. And to do this, I'm going to use a very old experiment originally designed by Dr. David Reed. And we're going to need a volunteer from the audience. That volunteer should not have an upper respiratory tract infection in the last few days, should not be prone to migraine, epilepsy, and if female, should not be pregnant, although this is not dangerous, it's just that no one uses a pregnant female in anything if you can avoid it. Now, to do this experiment, what we do is we get the subject to come here and to breathe from a bag that's going to be filled up with carbon dioxide, 7% CO2 in oxygen, in oxygen. Now, over the period of the next few minutes, we're going to get the subject to breathe into and out of that bag. I'll ask you later on what you expect will happen to the subject's ventilation during that period of time as they're rebreathing into the bag. And during those few minutes, we're also going to give the subject 2 episodes of artificial airway obstruction. We're not going to obstruct their own airways. We don't have ethical permission to do that. But we're going to constrict this tube here, which is leading to the bag, which will be in here. And that effectively has the same effect as obstructing the airways in the lungs. And then we're going to see what happens to ventilation as a result of that. This particular experiment also gives an opportunity to talk about what stimulus to breathing and some of the things that affect the drive to breathe. Now, Adele's going to fill the bag with the CO2 in oxygen. Why do we have it as CO2 in oxygen rather than CO2 in air? What's the risk if we had it as CO2 in air? You might become hypoxic, yes. So we don't want that for this experiment, but we will have a look at what happens in this, what might happen if we did make the subject hypoxic. Now, Zach will breathe through a mouthpiece to and from the bag. We'll put a nose plug on so that he doesn't, so that he only breathes to and from the mouth. So there will be a direct connection between Zach's lungs and the bag here. We've got a gas sampler here that's going into a gas analyzer that will measure CO2 partial pressures. And this device here, this is the tubing, there's a pressure transducer here that, with the right program, this program was written many years ago by a respiratory physician called Michael Burton-Jones, will calculate the volume of the bag movement, so tidal volume, and the number of breaths per minute, and work out in reasonably real time minute ventilation as it changes over time. We start off at 7% CO2 in oxygen. Do you know how to work out the partial pressure of CO2? So a few people are nodding their head. It's 7 over 100 times total pressure. And you'd normally say, well, that's 760 millimetres of mercury, which it is at room temperature. But something happens to air when you breathe it in and it moves over the mucous membranes. What happens? Anybody know? Yeah, it gets moisturised or humidified. Moisturiser is kind of what you put on your face, but anyway, it means So it gets humidified, and water vapour is added to fully saturating, which is 47 millimetres of mercury. So CO2, if you take 47 from 760, 7% of 713, which is about 50 millimetres of mercury. What's the CO2 in partial pressure in venous blood about? About 46, yeah. So this is above that. During the period of this experiment, as Zach is breathing into and out of the bag, what will happen to the CO2 partial pressure? It will go up. He's producing metabolic CO2 and it's going into a closed system. So the CO2 will go up. He's not going to become hypoxic because the rest of the gas is oxygen. And then during this time, Adele will turn this to a narrowing of this airway, which will have exactly the same effect as narrowing of his internal airways, at least on his overall ventilation. And you can think about what you think will happen. Now, remember to look at Zach's face and to look at the use of accessory muscles as well as we go on. As the CO2 increases with time, what do you think will happen to Zach's ventilation, minute ventilation? Volume, tidal volume times breaths per minute. The CO2 increases, what happens to ventilation? It will increase, yes. Okay, and then we'll see what happens when we give him an artificial attack of asthma. So he's taking a few deep breaths to equilibrate the air in his lungs with the gas in the bag. You can see the bag's now starting to move. You can see that Zach is not in any danger of becoming hypoxic. The CO2 is already hovering around the 50 mark. You can see he's reasonably comfortable and just breathing normally. CO2 is climbing relatively slowly. At the end of the experiment, we're going to analyse the rise in CO2 with time and the effect of that rise in CO2 on ventilation, and specifically pull out the times where, see that orange mark, in orange on the graph will be the sound of airway obstruction. Sounds a bit Darth Vader-ish, don't you think? I'm sure that's how they did the sound, or something like this, without all this high CO2 and so on. One of the things that I'm going to ask Zach at the end is when the airways were obstructed, whether he felt he stopped making much of an effort to breathe, or whether he just felt normal, or whether he actually seemed to be making more of an effort. You can see that the bag is moving, well, those people at the front can probably see the bag is moving in and out a little bit more than it was. Those of you who can see Zach at the front will see that he's starting to use accessory muscles, his neck muscles here, lifting the chest in upwards and forwards during inspiration. You can see his shoulders move. Zach is relatively large and... No, I just meant he's bigger than I am. Which is why the CO2 is going up relatively slowly. Size has an effect on ventilation parameters, as you're probably aware. And so most of the predicted values, you have to put in your age, because that affects your muscle capacity, and your height as a proxy for size, and your sex as well, again as a proxy for size and muscle strength. They're totally different predicted values for males and females. I don't know if you can see it from the front, but I can see it here looking at the side of Zach's neck. And it's definitely looking a little bit redder than it was, and I think if you look at his cheeks, they're looking a little bit redder than they were, which is perfectly normal, and I'll ask you about it when we've done this. Adele, second one. Okay. Try and just breathe as normally as you can. If you can see Zach now, you can see that the accessory muscles are really being brought into play. The bag is moving quite impressively now, in and out. Thank you very much, Zach. Please. Now, before you go, let me just ask you an important question. When the artificial airways obstruction came in, did you think you were making less of an effort, the same effort, more effort?
Definitely more effort.
Okay, so he's making more effort with the airways obstruction. Okay. Thank you very much, Zach. Much appreciated. Okay. Oh, good. This is the sort of raw data, so to speak. And you can see here, not so obvious with the first airways obstruction, but essentially what this is inspiration and expiration. Okay. This is the first episode of airway obstruction, and it's not quite as obvious because these aren't particularly large, but there is a tendency for less of an excursion, so volume in and out was not quite as great. As you can see, overall there is a big increase in tidal volume, and these are getting, each breath is getting closer together, so you've got an increase in breaths per minute as the CO2 increases. And then look at what happened with this last episode of airway obstruction. This is definitely smaller than all of these. Okay, that's the raw data. Now we'll go to the effect of time on CO2. So CO2 with time, that's it. You predicted that CO2 would increase with time breathing into a closed system, And in fact, that's exactly what happened. This is a line of best fit. The blue dots are with normal airways. The orange dots are with the obstructed airways. Regardless, the CO2 increased linearly over time, which is what we might reasonably expect. Okay, now what happens to ventilation as that CO2 increases? That's it. Good. Well, this is CO2 on the x-axis, going up to nearly 70, and minute ventilation in litres per minute on the y-axis. And you can see that under normal breathing circumstances, CO2 has indeed stimulated Zach's ventilation. The gradient isn't that high, but he's a fairly big, he's a tall person, sorry. Compared to some sort of small people that we get doing it. Anyway, that's the rate of ventilation increase with CO2. What I want you to concentrate on though is, and it's more obvious over here, look at the ventilation that he got for the airways obstruction periods. It's obviously a lot less down here than normal. And that's despite the fact that Zach told you he was making more of an effort. So the workload went up. Zach felt he had to make a major effort, muscle effort, to get things moving. And yet the ventilation that he got for that effort was considerably lower on average than when the airways were not obstructed. Now, this is a problem with anyone who's got airways obstruction. Their muscular effort may not be enough to maintain adequate ventilation to bring in oxygen and get rid of CO2. And so significant increases in the work of breathing, whether it be increased airway resistance or reduced compliance, may impact adequate ventilation. And that can be a big problem, as you can imagine.